This is an interview with Joe Boyd of Rockwood, Tennessee. It is August 4th, 1995, and I am John McManus. All right, if you could pick up what you were just talking about.
Well, the day I graduated from high school, the orphanage gave me $10 and wished me well. Now, they weren't all that mean and nasty, but if you had some place to go, they gave you $10. If you didn't have some place to go, they found a place for you somewhere, usually as a domestic, or if you were a girl, or if you were a boy, you got a job. Some farmer somewhere would give you a job. I went back to my home, but my mother, in the meantime, had remarried, and things weren't working out well there, so I headed off to the Army. And had been in the Army almost the entire enlistment when war broke out in December. I was due to get out in the following year. So, and by that time I was a sergeant, three-stripe sergeant. I went off to applied for flight school on the enlisted program, and just barely under the wire for age limit. Enlisted pilots did not have the same consideration as the pilots who came into training as cadets. Age was the main factor. Enlisted pilot could not be over 21 years of age. Cadet who were going to get training could be up to 27 and a half, and in some cases they waived that, let them go on in. So those guys mostly were older than me. And for my own personal thing, I was one of the older enlisted pilots to go through that training. Most of them were the guys who had just finished high school or maybe a year out of high school, and the draft was on at that time, and they had been drafted, and this was the means of moving up. Just about 100% of, if not indeed the 100% of the people who went into the enlisted pilots program had no college education at all. I mean, a lot of them were mechanics and armorers, and so forth. And in my personal case, I was a typist. I was working in the operations office, keeping up with records of pilots, and the amount of time they flew and the amount of time on the airplane. And so forth. So I went off to flight school and graduated with wings, same wings that the cadets got, so forth. But the first group of enlisted pilots that came out, they put them all in fighters. I was in about the fourth or fifth group. They ran off a class every 5 weeks. And I was about the fourth or fifth class. But that first group, they put them into P-38s out on the West Coast. And that was the wildest bunch of Indians that ever lived. They were flying under bridges and things like that. So by the time my group graduated, they started putting us all in transport planes.
So this first group that comes out, they've just been out of flight school for a week at the most. Primary flight training?
No, they went through the complete program,
right,
got their wings, and then they put them in the P-38s on the West Coast. But then every 5 weeks would be another group, so I was about 4 times 5 weeks, 20 weeks later. Maybe sixth class after or something, I don't know, but anyway, I was in August, and the first class came out about in March or April of that year.
You're talking 1942.
Yes.
Right.
So anyway, but then they were putting us all in flying transports or something, because they didn't want us out there on fighter planes. They shipped us, in my class, they shipped us up to Milwaukee, to Billy Mitchell Field, where we got some training from airline pilots. That was the type of flying we were going to do. We learned navigation, we learned night flying and weather and so forth. But we didn't get anything in the way of gunnery or like a fighter pilot would do, or flying formation and rapid changing positions. So we just learned to fly straight and level. That lasted about 30 days, and we didn't get much flying time then, because what they would do would take about 6 guys up at a time. You'd be up for a 3-hour flight. The instructor would sit up there with you, and he'd take one guy for 30 minutes. The rest of the guys would stay in the back of the airplane, and so he'd give you that one instruction he could in 30 minutes, and you'd switch to the back and just brought another fella up. We did that. I guess we must have gotten 25, 30 hours flying time during that time of actual hands-on flying, but we'd be in the air for 3 hours every day, just about. Then we went down. They shipped us down to Fort Benning, Georgia, Columbus, Georgia, where we were dropping paratroopers in their training. And then that's where we learned how to take off and land and do it a good job, because those flights were 10 minutes long.
Right.
We'd load up a load of paratroopers, take off, go out about a 2-mile circle, come back adjacent to the field. There was a big grass field, maybe 30, 40 acres or something. And we'd go be over that at 800, and we would drop these paratroopers and then make another 180 and land. We'd make 30, 35, 40 flights a day. All of them not over 10 minutes long. It was hard work. I mean, most of your hard work in flying an airplane to take off and land it, and the taxiing and everything you'd have to do. So, and from there, we shipped overseas. I got out of flight school in August and shipped overseas in November. Went the southern route down through Puerto Rico, South America, Junction Island, and then into Africa.
What part of Africa?
Well, eventually ended up, we landed in Gold Coast. I don't know what it's called nowadays. I know it's changed the name of it. I think it's Cameroon, maybe. I'm not sure. But then it was called the Gold Coast. We spent a week or two there, and then went by way of Zaire, then Belgium Congo, and went on across to Ethiopia, where we landed in the Sudan, and then in Ethiopia, then up to Egypt, where we were stationed right on the Suez Canal. And they were bringing in supplies up through Suez Canal, and we were hauling these supplies up, supplying the service to the Army up in the Libyan desert.
The British Army.
And our troops. So we had Air Force in there by that time. But we supplied British people too. Anything to get up and keep that army moving down there.
What sort of supplies did you fly into then?
We flew everything, from food to ammunition to gasoline. Load up an old DC-3 with 20 barrels, 55-gallon barrels, and put it in the baggage compartment and head for the front with it. Flying sergeants did that real well. We had some officer pilots, and they kind of
They didn't get that detail, did they?
They didn't get that detail too often. Also, we would fly from there, from Egypt down to Ethiopia. Pan American was in its infancy at the time, and they had contracts to haul supplies over to the war zone, but they didn't go into the war zone. They would fly to a depot in Ethiopia, and we had to fly down there and pick up these supplies, particularly heavy engines, things like that, for the big bombers. Now, those old airplanes wouldn't fly over about 10 or 11,000 feet. We didn't carry oxygen on them. They struggled to get to 11, 12,000 feet. You couldn't go any higher than that for lack of oxygen. The airfield in Ethiopia, actually it was in Eritrea, which I guess is a part of Ethiopia, it was at the time.
Right.
The airfield up there was at 7,000 feet. Now, when when we would go down, we were empty, and we could get up there all right. But getting off the ground with that load got to be kind of tricky. The airport was a short runway, and it ran to the edge of a cliff. And once you got about 3/4 of the mile, 3/4 of the way down the thing, you were committed.
Right.
You had to get off the ground. You were going off that cliff one way or another. So what we would do, and there was a 7,000-foot drop right down in the Dead Sea, 7,000 foot, just like a rock cliff. So what we would do, we would go down going down the runway, and when you got about 2/3 of the way down, you lower the flaps a little bit, hold it off the ground, but it wouldn't stay. You'd mush it back into the ground, you'd push it down and make it bounce, bounce, and over and down. And your timing had to be perfect because you couldn't let your back end hit the thing. You follow?
Right,
Follow.
yeah.
So what you had to do would be absolutely perfect on the bounce and up and down. And when you look back, the only thing you would see was this cliff behind you. You had 7,000 feet to go ahead and get your speed up and fly it out.
So how many times did you have to take off from there, approximately?
Oh, I probably did that 6 or 8 times.
Were there a lot of casualties?
No, unfortunately not. The old DC-3 airplane probably was the best airplane ever built. Absolutely, it was the most dependable. It just didn't have speed, it didn't have altitude, but it was probably the most dependable. Along the same line, going on the trip over from South America to Africa, you had to stop at Ascension Island. Are you familiar with Ascension Island?
I've heard of it. I can't place it in my mind
It's
geographically.
halfway across the Atlantic on that southern route.
Right.
It was a cone shaped. It was about 1 mile in diameter at the base. Our engineers went in and cut it out into a V. And everything they cut out of it went down into making the runway, and what they had left over, they pushed out on both sides, like a gangplank sticking out of this thing. Now, they didn't give you radio signals. You had nothing to go by except what your navigators in the airplane could tell you. You better hit that thing because you only had enough gas to get you there. We carried 4 50-gallon, 5-gallon drums, jerry-rigged in the cargo bay, where you had a petcock that you had to twist. So as soon as you got off the ground, leaving from Africa, or leaving from South America, head for this, you immediately switched off your wing tanks and turn one of these others on, and you had to sit there with a manual pump and pump it to get this stuff going through there. And there was no gauge on these tanks in the back. So you had to kind of estimate when you was going to run out of 55 gallons worth of fuel, and keep an eye on the gauge on the cockpit or when you started losing fuel pressure. And every now and then you'd see a plane kind of sway out of formation, and you knew exactly what happened. He'd run out of it, and hadn't changed his tanks on time. So
what would they do to alleviate the problem?
They never did alleviate it. You just had to live with it. I mean, you'd switch immediately. The crew chief would be back there switching from one tank to the next, and then you had to manually pump this pump to get the fuel flowing through again. So it was. We were flying maybe at 8,000 or 9,000 feet, and sometimes you'd lose 2,000 or 3,000 feet before you'd get this thing to work it again. If ever it hadn't worked, you were in the drink.
Would there have been any way to recover somebody?
I don't think so.
No ships on patrol.
I don't think you would ever. I mean, I think you've been dead if you went down there because there was nothing out there. Absolutely nothing that I know about. We were not briefed that there would be any assistance out there. We were went as a group. I mean, we must have had 50 airplanes. in about 4 different squadrons. But I don't think that you would have survived if you'd gone down. So that was one of the experiences I had. I had a lot of interesting experience flying transports.
Like, can you tell me about some?
Well, one time I had the honor of hauling the Archbishop Francis Spellman.
Mm-hmm.
He was a top Catholic in the country. I'm not a Catholic, so I didn't know what I had on my plane with me, but I hauled him for 3 days. And I'd have to wait for him all day, and it was hot and so forth. But when I would pull into a base where he wanted to go, well, all these people would be waiting, and they'd come swim around the plane, and he'd come down and make a little talk to them, and things that Catholics go through. Again, I'm not a Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't understand any of it.
Right.
But that was an interesting thing. There used to be a man here in Knoxville, nationally known journalist by the name of Don Whitehead.
Mm-hmm.
I had Don Whitehead on my plane one time for about 3 or 4 days. While we were going around making these places, hauling supplies and stuff. And he wrote up an article one time about the flying sergeants.
Really?
From this trip.
Mm-hmm.
And he wasn't writing about me, but he was writing about flying sergeants. But he said one such sergeant is Joe Boyd of Tennessee, and it made the National Wire Service.
It is.
And we weren't allowed to tell. Nobody was allowed to tell anybody back home where they were. So all these letters kept coming in. Well, we think we know where you might be because we saw this article, And then the guy would write back to his home, you know what Joe Boyd and I did the other day?
Captain's coming out of the bag at that point.
Yeah.
So they were pretty nice people.
Yeah.
The cardinal, or actually, we always knew him as the cardinal, but he was an archbishop at that point.
Yeah.
Spellman.
He was a nice person. Little bitty man.
Mm-hmm.
I don't guess he was over. He couldn't have been over 5 feet tall.
Really?
Yeah. And maybe he was shorter. He was almost. He wasn't quite a midget, but he was almost. I mean, he was much shorter than I am. I'm 5'6".
Mm-hmm.
So, so that was one of the things I had. Another interesting experience I had was I got sent up to Saudi Arabia one time and stayed 2 or 3 weeks. We were training some British. We was attached to the British outfit, just a couple of planes, and they were training some paratroopers for some special mission they had. And I didn't get to see the Saudi Arabia except the desert, but it was very secret hush thing. And we would go up there and we'd drop these guys, and they were training for some line. I always suspected that they were on enemy line somewhere, but we just stayed long enough to train them, and then we went back to our unit.
Did you get along pretty well with the British?
All right. They were, at that point in time, had been through so much. And sometimes there was some friction about where you Yanks been. We've been fighting this thing for many years, but I didn't know anybody who was all that anxious to get over there. But we got along with them all right. The Australians were the guys, and New Zealanders, they were the ones that we got along with best. I don't know, it just, they seemed to be more of a, come closer to being Americanized than the English did. And they were rough and ready. But we had a lot of association with them. And then we had a lot of association, or some association, with these little guys from Nepal called the Gurkhas.
Mm-hmm.
And you talking about some mean little rascals. Now they were the ones, all little. They wore turbans. Most of them had a beard, big bushy beard. And they carried a little crooked knife in his belt. It was about, I'd say 12 inches long and curved. Mm-hmm. And you could shave with it. It was that sharp. And if you asked him to see it, it pleased him no end. He would pull it out of his scabbard, cut himself on the hand or arm, enough to make it bleed, turn it around and hand you the handle so you could see it. But any time that knife came out of his scabbard, it brought somebody's blood. They were
Really?
tough.
So that was a thing with them. It had to do that.
Any time it came out of that scabbard, they brought blood, and they'd have little nicks all over their hands. Now their trick was to go. They would send them out at night. The British would, and they'd go slip on their stomach or whatever and get across German lines. In the desert, it gets very cold at night. It gets hotter than blazes, but at night it gets cold.
Mm-hmm.
And these Germans would sleep 4 or 6 in a trench to keep warm. They'd be all huddled up, and these guys would just love to slide in that trench with them with that knife and slit 5 of them's throat and let one guy wake up and find them next morning. That was the type of people they were. Their casualties were high, but they put the fear into the enemy.
They speak English?
Yeah. Some of it kind of pidgin English, but they speak English. You know, when they had this thing just recently down in the Falklands, you remember when they had that, when they, and the British were sending their troops down there? I was talking to my son one time about this war will be, they were sending the Gherkins.
Mm-hmm.
I said, as soon as they get there, this war will be over down there. They surrendered before they got a chance to land.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I don't think the Argentines would have been too pleased to see those guys.
Oh, that was one of the experiences I had. There's a lot of things. I landed on Gibraltar one time.
Mm-hmm.
They had a plane down up there and had to have an engine, and I flew that engine up there. And it's only 4 miles. There's only 4 miles between Gibraltar and Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And we were flying over the water, and I guess we got a little too close to Africa. They put a couple of shots across the front of our big.
The Spanish did? In Spanish Morocco there?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
How did you react to that?
We moved over closer to Gibraltar real quick.
Mm-hmm.
I made a trip one time into Malta. Malta was the most heavily bombed place in the world. I made one in there, and we flew, and they were constantly under attack by the Germans. Germans tried to bomb them into submission, and we flew just above the water across, and when we hit the island, we had to pull up a little to get onto the island, and we just pulled up and hit the runway and landed. We unloaded our engine and got out of there in a hurry because they were expecting another raid that night.
Really?
So
It was pounded at that time. 42, 43, or
yeah,
around there.
yeah. And then the worst thing I had was dropping paratroopers in Sicily.
So you were on that in July 1943.
Yes, I was.
Mm-hmm.
I was in that. And got shot up very badly on that new wind. We were supposed to drop them at like 7 minutes or some odd numbers, like 7 minutes past midnight or something. And then like another 5 minutes, the moon would go down. We'd have a full moon to drop them by. Well, the man leading the thing did not believe what his navigator told him, and he got lost. And we were about an hour late going in. We'd been briefed at 6 o'clock in the evening, or around 6 o'clock, for a mission at midnight. And we were supposed to drop these troops. It was the second day of the invasion. We were supposed to drop these troops about a mile behind enemy lines. Between the time we were briefed and we got there, the lines had moved about a mile, and we went down no man's land. The Americans shooting at us on one side, and the Germans on the other. The Germans knew who they were shooting at. The Americans didn't.
Mm-hmm.
We lost an awful lot of planes.
So some of them to friendly fire.
A lot of them to friendly fire, probably most of them. And then when we came out to sea, the ones who were out, the Navy was sitting out there, the invasion fleet, and they opened fire. We lost somewhere 50, 60 airplanes that night, and crews and so forth. I had a man that, one guy on my plane was shot in the neck. I suspect he probably died. One was an officer. I had trooper that got shot come up through the seat and hit him in the buttocks. He bailed out. He said, "I'm getting out of here." So I suspect he died, probably bled to death. And the crew chief was shot in the leg. We had a crew chief on there. He shot in the leg. We had one elevator of the plane had been hit. We had somewhere around 300 holes in that airplane. Of course, keep in mind, we just flying this above treetop,
Right.
800 feet. And so with the elevator, one of them, it was just hanging in rags. Was a canvas type elevator on the thing. Not like these planes they got nowadays where they're all titanium or something, but anyway, these were, and we had one elevator working. One spar in one of the wings was broken. It hung back like a wing on a crippled chicken. And we flew that thing back across the Atlantic, across the Mediterranean, and made a forced landing at 2:30 in the morning.
Where?
On the airfield in North Africa.
In Egypt?
No, we moved on up by this time.
To Libya?
We went around Tunis.
So what was the plane like to fly at that point?
We wrestled that thing all the way across that thing. I mean, it was like having an automobile that the steering is messed up on. I mean, you had to wait for a reaction on everything. So we got it back, and we left the wheels up. The wheels on those old airplanes did not have a cover over them. Actually, when you retracted your wheels, you could still see them. They just came up, and you could see them. And so actually, it would run a little bit on the wheels if you made a good smooth landing, on a belly landing. So so those were some of the things, problems or some of the experiences I had with it. And I'm sure there were others, but when we flew those planes with supplies, we hugged the ground all the way up where we were going, because we never knew when the Germans might attack. One time we had to haul gasoline into a forward base. We had, I guess they must have had at least 20 or 25 of those 55-gallon oil drums. On the way, our instructions were that on the way up, you pass this bomber base. There was an advanced bomber base, tactical bomber, 2-engine, thing called A-20s. You go over that base, and they will give you a flare. If the flare is green, you go onto the base we're telling you about. If it's red, you're going to land at the bomber base, because the base that we want you to drop this off has not been captured yet. We went up there and we got the green flare. We went up to the other. There was a Messerschmitt base that we run Germans out of, and all around you could see burning vehicles and stuff. We were that close behind the front with all this raw gas, 100-octane gasoline in the bay, in the storage bay. I might add that they were about all flying sergeants who made that trip.
No officers on that flight either.
No. So,
I have a couple of questions for you related to the Sicily. Now, those were C-47s you were
Yes.
flying that at?
Yes.
What was your opinion of that aircraft?
that was the airplane I mentioned a while ago, I thought was the best airplane ever built.
So
What it was made for.
not the DC-3, the C-47.
DC-3 and C-47 is the one and the same.
Oh, it's the one and the same?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we already know your opinion of that aircraft.
Yeah.
The other thing, it's been pretty well publicized in the past about 10 years or so among historians of some of the mistakes that happened with the paratrooper landings. There was a group that got shot up by the Navy, the naval flotilla. Now that wasn't your group. Did you know about it?
Well, they were shooting at us as we came out. And the Navy also shot some of our guys after they were in the water. Another group was bringing in paratroopers by glider. Mm-hmm. And the gliders cut loose too soon and landed in the water. Do you know the difference between a glider and a sailplane? A glider is going to come down. It has no means of going back up. A sailplane, if you get it up and catch the right thermals, you can stay up all day long.
Mhm.
They're towed off by another plane. They cut loose, and then if the weather conditions are right and thermals are rising, sometimes they keep them up, overnight even. At one time, the high altitude record was held by a sailplane. They got it out near the desert after Ohio City. But a glider will go so far. If his ratio is 20 to 1, he's going to go 20 feet for every one he loses.
Mhm.
But he's going down. Put him loose, he is going down. And when they cut these guys loose, they cut them loose too far out to sea, and they landed in the water. And the Navy has the record of having killed some of these guys.
Shot them up.
Yeah.
Sort of.
But the Navy, as far as the Navy's concerned, they were all German. And when they were shooting at us, they thought we were German.
Mhm.
As we went in on this thing at about 800 feet, as I mentioned, somewhere from up way high, a parachute flare suddenly floated loose down there. These magnesium flares were on their parachute. And it lit the sky up. I mean, you could see for 40 miles.
Hmm.
Now that silhouetted us against that light. And it floated down, I know, for 10 minutes or something like that. As they were going, coming down this thing. And they had a complete picture of anybody on the ground shooting. Just almost like shooting a pigeon going over.
Sitting ducks.
Yeah. And we lost an awful lot of airplanes, an awful lot of people. They must have lost in the thousands of people that night.
Now you got rid of your load of paratroopers, though.
Got
Right?
rid of our guys and got out and run that gauntlet with the Navy shooting at us. And they had those pom-pom guns. I mean, boom, boom, boom. They have 4 guns in a thing, and they're like big golf balls coming at you.
How did you guys feel about that at the time? Were you angry about it?
Well, it was our first experience actually when we got into where we've been shot at. We were devastated. I'm told I left shortly after that. I had made application to get into fighters, and the application when I had finally learned how from a sergeant in the order room, I'd been making an application every month and put me in fighters, and then I might write to the CO of the squadron, and he would always mark it disapproved and put it on my file. And one day when I was writing this in there, this sergeant working in the order room, he said, "You know you're not doing this right." That's what I need to do. He says, "Write to a general of the 12th Air Force and tell him you want to fly fighters." And he said, "And heaven help you if he turns you down, because you're going to be on the list of this commanding officer forever." So I did that. And what the sergeant told me was, he has to send it on. He doesn't have the privilege, the option of turning it down if you write to the general. So he marked it disapproved, and he sent it on. Sent it to the group headquarters. That man marked it disapproved and sent it on to wing headquarters, disapproved, and sent it on to the 9th Air Force, which is what we were in at the time. They sent it on to the 12th Air Force, where General Cannon was. He was commanding officer of the 12th Air Force. And he put a notation on it. From time to time, I see pilots who don't want to fly combat for one reason or another. Here's a man who does show cause why this should be disapproved. So it came back down the ladder again, and everybody put an endorsement on it saying, show cause, show cause, show cause, till they got to the squadron commander. He got the message, and he marked it approved, and it went back up the chain. So it took about 2 or 3 months for all this to transpire. So when the orders came through to transfer me to fighters, it came in when they were organizing this parachute drop-in system. And this guy, the commanding officer, who was already a little bit aggravated about it, he just laid over on his desk and said, send these guys, there's 3 of us. He said, send these guys on that mission. And so one guy got killed, I got shot up, and the other guy didn't make the trip for him. He had a fire in his tent and got burned. He was in the hospital that day. So that left 2 of us, and we made the trip. And then after the mission was over, and came in about a day or 2 days later, he called us into the order room and said, well, here's your transfer. Good luck. You know, so we had to hitchhike all the way across the continent, get there the best way, over at Casablanca, where they were supposed to have a school. Got over there and found out it wasn't a school. It was a replacement center. So they had 2 officers in the whole thing. One was a West Point captain, and the other was a 2nd lieutenant who was grounded for medical reasons. He had some kind of problem. You know. So the captain says, take these guys out and check them out in this airplane. We didn't get to read the manuals. We didn't do anything. Just go in. So I got in the cockpit, and he got up on the wing. There's a throttle. You pull so many inches of mercury on, you know, and you set the props at such and such. Here's where you yank up the gear. Sometimes it hangs up, so you got to do this. Then show me something to do. I got about a 10-minute check like that. And he said, good luck. So I flew it. And for a couple of hours. And
38?
Yeah. And it was an old wore-out wreck. I mean, so the next day, took it up again, and when I got down that 2nd day, I had orders to report to the front. And when I got to the front, they thought that I was ready to go, and I was on the mission next day. Didn't know the first thing about flying formation, didn't know how to turn the guns on. The first time I ever fired the guns on a P-38, I was shooting at a German. Missed him, but I was shooting at him. didn't know the first thing about leading him and all this, you know. Wow. So it was sort of a hairy experience.
You must have been pretty apprehensive.
Now, when you get into a fight in those fighter planes, you're not cruising anymore. While you go out, you're cruising at a such speed. You know what time you're supposed to be over target and so forth. But when the fight starts, you shove everything forward. And that's what we were doing. And when you do that, you use up your gas very rapidly. Very rapidly. It's kind of like a guy doing drag strip racing or something. And because I had never had formation flying, I was all over the sky. I was messing everybody up.
Well, like how?
Well, I would fall behind, and then I'd shove everything forward trying to catch up, and I would overshoot the formation. And then I'd cut everything off and try to get back in position. I'd get behind again. I was all over the sky. And I used up my gasoline too fast. I mean, I had enough gas to get where we were going and back, from Africa up to the Naples area where we were going. And I had enough gas to get back if I hadn't used it up so rapidly. We had a radar station down there. Somebody had worked up. And radar was in its infancy in those days also. What they would do is put a radar station on a hill somewhere over here and one on the other somewhere else. And when you would call in for with a problem, they could locate you by moving, and they threw out a beam like just like a garden hose, except it'd reach out 40 or 50 miles or something. So they would throw it out and run this thing around till they found you. But when they found you, there was one on this hill. The only thing they showed was you were somewhere down that line, but they couldn't tell you where it was. So they'd have to pick you up on the one on the other side, and where they would vector, that's where you were. So I called this fella, and you had to give him a reading, like he had you count to 10 or something. And I did, and I told him I had 10 minutes gas supply, and I was about 10 minutes out over the water. So he said, well, you can't make it back to your base, but you take a heading of such, whatever it was, and look for a field. You're just about exactly 10 minutes away. So, and then he'd check on me every 2 or 3 minutes. He'd call me back and get another fix. And finally he says, you ought to be right directly over this field. Now this was a field that was abandoned. There was nobody on it. Grass field. And I was probably up 3,000 or 4,000 feet looking for it. And all of a sudden...
It's on Sicily, the field?
No, this Sicily was in North Africa.
So
we were not in... We had... Our ground troops had invaded Sicily at this time, but all the aviation things were going on from North Africa.
Okay.
And so he had me... He had me right over the field, and I dived the plane trying to get down without... Because my gas cages were sitting on empty. Came in too fast, too hot. So I had to pull up and go around, and starting around, one engine cut out, and then I came down on the final leg, and the other one cut out, and I dead sticked it in. Right then I was thinking I belonged in troop transport. Yeah.
You have sort of a longing to go back to the transport? Or?
Never did it, but right at that moment I thought so. And then the second mission I ever flew was the one I gave you the write-up on there of Cecil,
Right.
Rudnick.
Right.
That was the second mission I ever flew.
And so what exactly happened on that mission?
Oh, that was a horrible thing. I can only tell you that we lost about half a squadron, and again, I was all over the sky. I had to learn my formation flying and gunnery and on-the-job training. So I was lucky to survive either one of those 2 missions. But gradually, I got where I could handle that. I like to think of myself as being a good pilot, but I was not a good combat pilot because I wasn't trained for it. Mm-hmm. I was trained to know how to fly at night, know how to fly on instruments, but all as a single plane. I had absolutely no knowledge of gunnery, none. Mm-hmm. I'd never even fired a pistol. So here I was with 450 caliber machine guns and a 20 millimeter cannon. But due to the fact that I had all this other time, see, I'd been over a year at the time I joined this thing, and most of the pilots came in just out of flight school, doing a little bit of training outside, and then shipped overseas. Well, as far as the actual flying was concerned, I was probably the equivalent of 2 or 3 years ahead of most of them. Not that much, but due to the fact that we logged so very much time when we were down flying in the desert. It wasn't uncommon at all for us to fly 200 hours in a month. Mm-hmm. And so, and I'd been over about a year doing that, so I had 1,600 hours time overseas at the time I joined this fighter squadron. But it was stuff that wasn't conducive to being a good fighter pilot.
Right.
But when I finally got on to flying the formation and so forth, then my advancement in the squadron came rather rapidly because of the fact that I had more experience. And I was up on my 6th mission. I got shot down.
How did that come about?
Well, this was during an invasion of Italy. I was flying tail in Charlie. They start you off in the number 2 position. Red, you had 4 flights to make up a squadron. 4 flights of 4 airplanes each. And you had a red flight, which is the leader, and a green flight, no, white flight, a green flight, and yellow flight. And then in those flights, you had positions 1, 2, 3, and 4. Mm-hmm. The safest position you could be in was 2. And your first 5 missions, you flew in a 2 position. And really the safest you could possibly be was red 2. You were flying the squadron leader's wing. Mm-hmm. But after your 5 missions, then you went to tail in Charlie. And that's where you were most vulnerable. So that was my first mission at in Charlie. We took off. In the meantime, we had moved up to Sicily, to a base in Sicily, and we were trying to cover this invasion at Salerno.
Mm-hmm.
We took off early in the morning, 7 airplanes. And, we actually had 8 to start off with, and one man dropped out from mechanical problems. So we had 7, and I was the last man there. And we were flying about 30,000 feet above the invasion area.
Mm-hmm.
Now, at that altitude, you can see 35, 40 miles. We could see the German base. We saw these Messerschmitts taxiing out. The man leading this thing called the commanding general or admiral, whoever was running the thing down in the bay, and told him what was happening. We see these Germans getting ready to take off. Said, we only have 7 airplanes up here, and we would like to attack them while we have the advantage. Stay where you are. So we watched them all taxi out, take off, get in formation, staying out about 10 miles, climbing up. He called again. We would like to hit them while we have the altitude and sun advantage. Stay where you are. There's about 35 or 40 of them, I guess. You could never count the number of enemy planes up there. It's like a flock of birds. You see a flock of birds go by, you don't know whether it's got 100 in it or 150. Mm-hmm. But we figured it's 35 or thereabouts. Watch those rascals climb up, get above us, get in the sun, and here they came. And we had tail in Charlie. They hit me first.
Really?
And knocked out one engine, knocked out the complete electrical system. Now the props on the airplane, or you feather them electrically, so I couldn't feather the dead engine. Do you understand feather the engine?
It's a way to get the fuel.
No, it's a way to get the prop to turn where it's biting into the wind. It turns straight, and then it will stop. It'll stop windmilling.
Mm-hmm.
If it continues to windmill, then it creates holds you back.
Right.
So I couldn't stop this thing from windmilling. And of course, Germans followed me down. One of the rules of war among anybody that's in combat is shoot the cripples. I mean, you go after them. You don't want them coming back next week.
Mm-hmm.
So they followed me down. And I got so close to the water that they couldn't get under me. To make a good pass at a guy in a fighter plane, you almost have to attack him from a little bit below him. If you're behind him, you want to be about 10 feet below him, so the guns sort of angle up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I got so close to the water, they couldn't get under me. My good engine was stirring up spray on the ocean.
Really?
Yeah, that's how close I got to it. I could see the bullets falling out there in the water around me, but they couldn't get in position to. They were single-engine planes, and on the single-engine planes, your guns are in the wing, and they zero them in to usually about 300 yards. Now, if you get too close, the guy is in this area and is focusing out above you, and if they're too far if you're too far ahead, then it crosses and the bullets are dispersed. So I can see bullets dropping in the water around me.
This is what, 2 ME-109s?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so they followed me a ways, and then they let up on it. So my electrical system was shot out, and my compass was electric. And I flew that thing back across the Mediterranean without a compass. We're lying on the position of the sun. It was late in the afternoon, and the sun was going down in the west, and I knew where south was, so I headed for Sicily. But the fact that my engines weren't, my gauges weren't working, I couldn't tell how much gasoline I had. And I had about 100 gallons of gasoline in the left engine that I couldn't get to because there's electric solenoid in there that transferred this over to the other engine. And eventually, and I hit the Sicily. Mount Etna comes out of the on the north side of Sicily. Mm-hmm. It's about 10,000 feet high, and I couldn't get any way close to getting around that or over that thing. So I started around the island. The Mount Etna comes out of the water. It just comes up. There's no beach. Mm-hmm. Come right down, and I was probably not over 600 yards off the beach, flying around the island looking for places where I might bail it in. And that's when the other engine quit. So I popped into the water almost immediately, and the airplane hit, slid, sank in that order, and about that fast. I almost drowned getting out of the airplane.
You had trouble with the canopy or something?
Yeah. You had the canopy was set to pop loose at about 160 miles an hour if you released it. And I'd released it before I hit the water. And when I hit the water, the impact slammed it to again, and it stayed. And I had to go through it. It broke, and I was in the water and sinking. I'm still in the airplane. On the way, when I thought I might have to go in the water, I had tied my dinghy to me. We sat on a dinghy between the parachute and the body. Mm-hmm. And I had tied this dinghy to my Mae West straps. And then when I got out of the airplane, in the water, but out of the airplane, the dinghy got caught in this wrecked canopy. And so when I was taking on water in my mouth and lungs, I was thinking, I managed to grab a hold of the strap that I had tied to this and pull myself deeper into the water so I could get my feet. The strap was longer than my legs. Mm-hmm. And I pulled me down further into the water where I get my feet on the airplane, and I gave it a yank and it came loose. But I tore it in the process. So when I came up and got to the surface, spitting and sputtering and coughing, inflated the life raft, and it blew up and then slid back down. So I had the life jacket, Mae West life jacket. So I discarded that. Discarded the dinghy. I could see shore. It wasn't big. Mile 4 out I was, not 4. I could swim that far. So I started swimming. I didn't make much progress. And I said, take off your shoes. Stupidest mistake I could ever make. That volcanic mountain over there.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I took off my shoes and discarded them. Started swimming. The next morning I was still swimming. The current was taking me out to sea. The current going through the Straits of Messina, right where the toe of Italy almost touches it. We found out later it goes through there at about 8 miles an hour. Mm-hmm. Around where I was, probably 4 or 5 miles an hour, taking me north. The next morning I could barely see the top of Mount Etna, which is 10,000 feet high. I must have been 30, 40 miles out to sea. But and the life jacket was getting weak. They were designed to hold you X number of hours. I don't know how many, but I'd been out there maybe over 12 at that time. And mostly I was treading water. I was still treading water around noon. And didn't have long to live. It was that close. And a British PT boat came by.
Just happened to come by.
They were looking for one of their men. They had a man down somewhere. So I started waving, making all the bracket and everything I could. He just whizzed right on by. He must have got 400 or 500 yards past me when a guy standing on the back of his boat suddenly let out an alarm and pointed, and they cut their engines and swung around. They threw a rope ladder down for me to climb up, and I couldn't get up it. I was
Too tired.
too tired. And a couple of guys went down that ladder, and they grabbed me by the shirt and tossed me on board just like as if you had a fishing pole and you flipped a fish out of the water. I had lost somewhere around 25 pounds during that time, and I was not matured as I am now. In those days, I weighed about 135 pounds or something like that, and I was nothing but skin and bones. In here, like for instance in your arm where those leaders go down, now all the fat was out of that, and you could see my arm in here was about that big around, like I'd come out of a concentration camp, and you could see every leader across the waist and around here, where the muscles in there. You could see every one of them. You could count them. There wasn't anything in there. Now my face in here, all was out of here. Now this didn't leave me. I was like a heart-shaped face right down. My legs in here couldn't have been more than 3 inches, 4 inches in diameter. But you could see every muscle, just like ropes under the skin. And well, anyway, this Britisher, they got me up on deck, and I stand up there, and another thing I had, I need a haircut when I go into war zone. You don't get a haircut just running down to the shop.
Right.
My hair was long, and I had all this long stuff in it, standing straight out. Skinny face, skinny guy. So this Britisher standing there in his white uniform, white shorts, white knee socks, white shoes, white hat with all the gold braid on it. He said, "It's a bloody yank." I said, "Okay, don't throw me back."
Yeah.
He says, "I say, old boy, did you see any sharks?" I said, "No, was I supposed to?" He said, "Well, it's shark infested, So, but I don't think there were sharks around where I was. I was bleeding pretty good, and
From your feet?
I had cuts all over my arms and everything getting out of. And no, I didn't. The fact I didn't have shoes didn't bother me because I never got to land. But if I got to land, I couldn't have walked. So. But I got cut up pretty bad. I almost lost an ear. And
From an infection?
no, from getting out of that airplane.
Mm-hmm.
And I got my arms cut up pretty badly. And I passed out. After that, they on their boat, and I don't know when they took me. Later, they took me to the hospital. And the British guys who pulled me out of the water took my insignias, my wings, those were souvenirs. They weren't thieves. They were taking souvenirs off this guy they pulled out of the water. Because I had money, they didn't take it. If they were going to be stealing, they were taking the money too.
Yeah.
But anyway, I was in the hospital for about 4 days, and of course this weight came back on very rapidly as soon as I got taking water and soups and stuff they were feeding. But I was there without any shoes. So finally I went outside. I said, I got to get back to my outfit. So I went outside and I got to find me some shoes. So First guy I ran into was a spit and polish infantry officer. He must have been straight out of 90 Days School. And I walked up to him and said, "Hey, Mac," and that was as far as I got. I never got such a cussing as a man could get. Here I was, no insignia, shirt sleeves rolled up, pants had been in the 18 hours of salt water, the hair was sending out in all directions, no shoes. He started dressing me down, and every time I would try to interrupt him, he'd, "Don't you interrupt me, soldier." You know. Finally, I let him run down. I said, "Now, if you'll listen for a minute, let me tell you, I got as much rank as you got. Now pay attention to what I'm getting ready to tell you." So I told him what my problem was, and he kind of apologized. He said, "Where do you need to get to?" And I told him. He said, "Load it up in my Jeep. I'll take you home." So he took me down, drove me about 100 miles or whatever it was, down to where our base was. And when I got there, we were living in a grape vineyard in a great big bramble tent. We had about 12 guys sleeping in a tent with the sides out. And there was a poker game going on. Well, somebody looked up, and he was dealing. And he looked up and he said, "They're coming here." So they all came running out. And some guy said that Tennessee character wouldn't have got home if he hadn't taken off his shoes. But one guy was sitting over there said, "Deal with damn cards." He'd lose it.
So much for you, you know.
Yeah. So that was an experience I had.
Well, one thing I was wondering about, do you have any recollection of that time when you were in the water, you were conscious the whole time?
Yes.
Do you remember what you were thinking at the time?
Yes. I would pray a lot, and then I'd get mad and I'd cuss a lot. And then I'd pray and say, "Lord, forgive me for all that cussing." Actually, sometime during the night, I would drift in and out of sleep. This May West fit up the back of your head, but then water would splash over on me and about drown me. So it was. But I had a lot of thoughts. I've heard it said that when you get ready to go, your life passes in front of you. I remembered a lot of things back from my childhood. The man that raised me in that orphanage was probably the most wonderful fellow I ever met or ever knew. I guess he'd be more like a father to me. And he had brought something home to me very strongly in my youth. In those days, and in the orphanage, I don't know whether it was that true all over, in the orphanage, you could play athletics, even high school athletics, even before you got into high school. Mm-hmm. And I made the high school baseball team in my last year in grammar school. I won 5 letters in baseball. But the first game I was ever in that thing, and back then when I was a little fellow on the team, I made about 6 or 8 errors. I was awful. And and we lost the game. And everybody got on me pretty heavy. "You lost the game," you know, as kids will do. And it broke my heart. I mean, I just sat down and squalled. And this man came over and sat down beside me. And he said, "Rough day, huh?" "Yes, sir." He said, "Do you know how steel is made?" "No, sir." He said, "Well, you got to get this ore and you put it in a big pot and you build a fire of it and you have to heat it till it becomes liquid. You understand what I mean?" "No, sir." He said, "Well, you will." And he said, "The hotter the fire, the better the steel." And he said, "We started toughening you up today. You're going to be the star on this team." He brought it home to me. And I can remember thinking about that when I was out there. When I didn't see any hope of ever getting picked up, and I was slowly drowning because his life jacket was losing its strength to hold me up, I'd say, why don't I just take this thing off, swim away from it as far as I can, then I'll drown and it'll be over with. And I would very slowly do it, and then that voice would come through, you're tougher than steel. You don't do this. I'd snap it back and start paddling again. So that's one of the things I thought about. I thought about my childhood during those times a lot when I was at the Voyage. Mm-hmm. It's a very fine school, very fine. And very dedicated people. Can't have that now. There's a lot of political talk about orphanages, but they can't have it now. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the things I do. Now, let's see it. Later, I went to places like I've been flying across the Alps into Germany. Mm-hmm. I made a trip one time we flew a mission into Greece from down southern Italy. And then we always had problems with oxygen. There was always a problem with oxygen.
What sort of problem?
Well, sometimes it didn't feed through like it ought to, or and when you did, but on this, I suddenly found myself blacking out, and I happened to glance down, and we had a flexible tube under this oxygen mask, and this tube had come loose, and there was no oxygen at all coming in. So I immediately had to yank off my oxygen mask and poke this tube in my mouth. I went through a fight up there with like a garden hose stuck in my mouth. And this went over 15 or 20 minutes. I couldn't talk to anybody. I could hear everything going on, but the microphone was in the oxygen mask. Yeah. And I was leading one of the flights. Couldn't talk to my wingman or anything. We had those kind of problems in those airplanes.
This was a P-38.
P-38, yeah. Another problem they have with that airplane, it got compressibility. If you got the airplane going down at a rapid speed, the controls would reverse themselves, and you couldn't pull it out to die. A lot of people got killed before they figured out what was happening. They finally put some little dye flaps and things on to make it better. So, that was one of the missions. I went on that same mission that we went to Greece. We lost a pilot. We always sent they sent a PBY, that's one of those flying boats, out following the mission if it was over water. And they would meet us. They'd go with us as far as they could, and then maybe a different crew would, or maybe the same crew, I don't know, but they'd be there when we came back. And some fellow had to bail out on the way back, and they made contact and got where they could see him and watched him bail out. And by the time they could get down, they landed in the water. By the time they could get down, the only thing they found was blood in the parachute. He must have dropped straight into the mouth of sharks, so he was gone. Those were very brave guys that flew those airplanes because they couldn't outrun anything. They were very slow. If ever they got caught, they were goners. We went into a bombing mission one time into Cagliari, which is the harbor at Sardinia, and one of our guys got shot down and landed out in the harbor, and he was close enough that they could shoot at him from the shore. And we went down and strafed the town. We strafed anything that moved or even looked like it was going to move. We were like a bunch of hornets over that area. And this guy flying that boat landed in there and went and got that pilot. Now, he's close enough they could put rifle shots in his airplane, but he went and got it. there was a lot of brave men in the wars that never got credit. Talked to Dr. Johnson on the phone, and he said he was looking for the guys who actually fought for him, you know. So I'll tell you a group of men that was very important and never got a bit of credit. That was the guys who flew weather missions. Let's say from southern Italy, we had to fly either into France or Germany or across Yugoslavia to bless the oil fields in Romania, sometimes to Greece, places like that. But anyway, they're going out in a different direction, but they didn't know probably until 5 o'clock in the morning where they would go. They would plan alternate flights. Now, these were big formations. They may be 1,500 bombers in the thing, with 500 fighter planes to fly as escorts. But didn't know where they would go until they sent somebody to check the weather. Now, the Germans controlled all the areas where we were going into, and they're not going to tell you. So they had to send somebody. Now, these guys, they got up around 2 o'clock. It took off around 2 o'clock in the morning. And they went by themselves. Night at night and bad weather. And they'd send one up into France, one across into Germany, and so forth. And they took all the armor plate out of their airplanes, all the guns out of it. If you get attacked, the thing you do run. That's what you have to rely on speed, because you can't stay up there and fight these guys. You don't have the very equipment and no support. So they took everything out. They'd send these guys, and they'd leave by 2 o'clock in the morning when they would get up there and check the weather, they would call the information back, and then when they would determine where the mission was going. Those were very brave men. Very brave men. Never got a bit of credit. I had one that was in my flight, and his name was John Eastman. Big man, almost too big for fighters. And he was always in trouble, Lieutenant. And he was always in trouble. He'd go off fly over to Yugoslavia all by himself and go shoot up somebody, or he'd come in with leaves stuck in his cowling where he just barely skimmed the top of a tree or something. They're in trouble all the time. And they put him in my flight. I seemed to end up being the old sergeant pilot. I ended up with all the renegades, and he was one of them. And he always said, you and me, we'll win this war. So he's going on a mission up into northern Italy one time, and the number 2 man dropped out. The number 3 man dropped out, and he was flying till they charted his own place and let him fly. He pulled up on my wing and started motion, you and me, you know. So just the 2 of us flew that mission. And on the way out, I looked around for him, he was gone. And I called him on the radio and called him. No answer. So I got home, went to debriefing, and I went back up to the squadron area, and there he sat. I said, Big John, where'd you get to? He said, I never had an opportunity to see that leaning tower. And he said, I figured this was the best time. And he'd gone down there all by himself, 300 miles up in enemy territory, and made 3 or 4 circles around that leaning tower.
In Pisa.
Yep. He was that type of man. He was. They took him out of flying with us and put him to fly that weather thing. He didn't like it.
Really?
No. So then finally, when they got through doing that, they put him. We later had invaded a place called Anzio, which was a disaster. And because of the hills, right 10, I don't know how high, maybe 5,000 feet looking down at them. And they'd get those big guns up there. And they had him flying up and down and letting people shoot at him so they could try to locate the guns. And he got shot down. doing that. Bailed out in, he's in no man's land. He jumped in a bomb crater, and he could look in one direction, see the Germans coming out after him, and he looked in the other direction, see the Americans coming after him. The Americans got there first. I never knew what happened to him. We had a man get shot down one time. We were on strafing run. Strafing was very hard business. If a guy saw you coming and could get that machine gun up, he could just throw a stream up and you run into it. And he was on strafing run and caught a train and shot it, and it blew up. It was an ammunition train. And he must have been maybe not over 50 feet from the ground when he hit it. And when it knocked him out, the concussion from it knocked him out. When you're on a strafing run, you trim your airplane, so if you look away or take your mind off of what you're doing for a second, you trim it where it'll go up.
Mm-hmm. Right.
When he came to, he was at 7,000 feet in a spin, and the airplane was coming apart. He has no idea how high he went before he came to. His airplane, he was going so fast that the airplane was coming apart, so he immediately released his canopy and bailed out. So the wind sucked him out. And when the wind hit his face at the speed he was going, it burst all the blood vessels in his eyes, and he came down that parachute blind. He couldn't see at all, and landed and had to lay there for about 3 days before somebody found him. The Italian partisans found him, and about 2 or 3 weeks later, he was back in the squadron. His eyes still were solid. He'd started to go where he could see a little bit, but they were still solid red. That's one of the type of things. Anyway, I flew the missions, and in time to go home, I was still a flight officer. And the commanding officer said he'd been trying to provoke me, give me a battlefield commission, and it hadn't worked. He said, "You're not going home. I'll keep you here till the war's over if you get this commission. I'm not going to have a man come in here and do the things that you've done and go home a flight officer. Mm-hmm. No way." He said, "I want you to go take a rest. Go to the Isle of Capri." Well, my tent mate and I, we went over to the Isle of Capri. Supposed to stay a week. Unfortunately, we didn't make the boat coming home on time.
Funny thing.
We were there for about 10 days. And when we got back, it got on me pretty heavy. He said, "Now, for that, I'm going to send you to Africa to get some airplanes I got down there." We were short of airplanes. And they would send these airplanes over on a converted flat top, almost like a miniature aircraft carrier, flat on top. They'd stack these airplanes up on the front with no wings on them. Airplanes didn't stack like cordwood. The wings would. And then after they got them off at Casablanca, then they would they put the wings on them, and they had to be test topped, and then they'd fly them up. So he sent me down there with about 4 or 5 brand new pilots, second lieutenants that just come in. He said they need some flying time anyway to learn what they're doing. So make them fly formation. So I'd have to go down and test these airplanes as they'd get the wings and worked out. And then I'd lead these 5 or 6 new pilots up, and we'd fly formation all the way back across Africa. Fly them up to Tunis. And land them up there, and he had another crew picking them up. They'd fly them up, and we had about 50 airplanes to take up like that. Made about 10 trips across the continent of Africa doing that. While I was down there, he had this he had a commission come through for me, battlefield commission. And I wasn't there to get it. So he had a surrogate stand in and swore me in. And the same day, he put me in the first lieutenant. And 18 days at the time, I was commissioned a second lieutenant. I became a first lieutenant. I had been through the mill on this thing. I'd moved up. I'd led a lot of formations. Some of this information there, when you'll see that I led an entire wing, sometimes 250 airplanes, and I was a flight officer. And so when they got me in that, then they came around sometime later and said, how about flying a few extra missions for us? I was ready to come home. I had no 50 missions yet. Actually, counting troop care, I had 70-some missions. And he said, how about flying a few extra missions for us? We need some experience. We'd had heavy losses. I don't know. He said, tell you what, you fly 10 extra missions, I'll make you count them. Okay, you're on. So I went down to the briefing room. He said, you lead the mission tomorrow. Went down to the briefing room next morning, and they have these, I know you've seen it, curtains across. They pulled back the curtains, and here's these strange structures from here to yonder. We were going to the Pulaski oil field. So I led that mission. We got out and got over and back all right. About a week later, he said, well, you lead the mission tomorrow. Okay. So went down to the briefing room. Here's those strings again, Pulaski oil field. So went several days. They came out and said, you go to, came in one night, said, you're leading the mission tomorrow. Okay. He said, we will brief you tonight. Come with me. This was intelligence officer. The command officer, intelligence officer, and me, we went to the briefing room. And it had an MP, sergeant, sitting there, you know. So the mission was to go from where we were down in southern Italy up into the Po Valley. We were about to break out of the NGO beachhead. And the Germans were bringing planes down, and a spotter plane had been up there and located them, recon plane. And we were going to go up there and get them next morning before daylight. So we got off the ground with 48 airplanes around 4 o'clock in the morning. And we went out to sea at treetop level, pitch black. So we went out to sea and got down close to the water and headed north. That was on the west side of Italy. Went up to Genoa and had to cut down, go down through the Po Valley. And we got down there and did a lot of damage. Lost some people. What they didn't brief us on was there was another field they'd overlooked telling us about. And we shot up one field. We alerted the one on a little further. And as we pulled up and leaving that thing, well, these other guys were waiting on us. A guy with a machine gun put about 20, 25 holes in my airplane. Went right directly under me on an upward slant, like a woodpecker going up that thing, and put holes all the way from one end to the rear end. And I got home. I fly those 10 missions or not. The next day, a man went out in my airplane and got killed. So I went over and told the command officer. It was an option I had at this point in time. I think I'll have to go home. So, and I went back, shipped back to the States. And after a brief period of time, they shipped me out to California. When I got out there, on this base, they were looking for somebody to be a test pilot. And since I didn't know anything about being a fighter pilot, which I admit, I still didn't know gunnery. I took the fighter pilot job. Now, fighter pilots, I'm not fighter pilots, test pilots. Again, I was a good pilot, but I was never a combat pilot, as I've said. So I was testing these airplanes. Now this wasn't the type of testing you get if you were one of these daredevil type people. This was for maintenance. They take an airplane and it had to be worked on before they go back up and down somebody's flight. So I was doing that. And I just got married, and I lived up there and did that for quite some time. I was 8 months. Later, I was shipped off to Okinawa. The war was over. I was going to stay in service, and I became a operations officer for a night fighter squadron, Black Widow. And that's when I decided I'd get out. I'd had enough of it.
Why is that?
Well, service kind of fell apart for a short period of time there. The good mechanics left. They had all good jobs waiting for them. The better pilots left. The guys, and I don't want to be critical of people who got stuck in training jobs, so forth, but they hadn't been overseas, but you were still being, the final thing of the war had not been settled. And if you went overseas during this period, you were considered in the war zone. Even though there was no shooting going on, the war didn't really end for about 3 or 4 years after that, officially. So they were growing combat credits. And a lot of people who had been in training commands and West Pointers, they all was over there. They enjoyed overseas time during this time. And it wasn't the same as when you were in that combat zone with a camaraderie that went with, your life hanging in balance. You trusted your friends and so forth. I had 3 West Pointers come in. They were under me at the time. By now that I was captain, and these were second lieutenant just out of West. They were rated pilots. The P-61 night fighter was a single pilot airplane. It had a 3-man crew. It had a gunner, a 450 caliber machine gun with a turret like in a bomber. Not like on a fighter plane. Fighter planes are fixed.
Right.
But this thing would swing around, and then we had a radar man. And these guys were, but before, as operations officer, all the flying came under me. And I would not check these. I checked all the pilots out that we had come in there. But you couldn't go up with him in a plane, so we got a B-25 bomber, which had almost the same characteristics of flying. And you had 2 pilots on that, so I could take these guys up and see how they were doing. It took me about 2 or 3 weeks to check one of these guys out. I had 3 of them. It took me 3 months to check another one out. And one I never did check out. I had him 9 months. And I suggested that he might ought to take a ground job. He wasn't qualified to be a pilot. And next thing I knew, I was standing in front of a full colonel who was reading me the riot act for abusing his man.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that WPPA works very well. They got that ring that they knock on the table when they're telling you they're giving you this all the time. They're talking to you, So they rate me over the cold pretty good over there, but things like that, and it just got where it wasn't,
Right, it was the West Pointers looking out for their own. And
Oh, they take care of their own.
Yeah.
I had a friend I went to high school with, stayed in the service 30-something years, became full colonel. He couldn't get into the Air Force when the war started, and he went to Canada and joined the Air Force up there. And then after we got into it, they transferred those guys down here, and that's how he got into service. And he was in Vietnam. And he, at one of our reunions, he told me that his son was a colonel, and his son's job was to keep track of what all the various locations were, choice locations, and move the West Point people in. Those were the things that kind of made it disgusting. And then when I had to go back into service and saw how it had fallen apart, then I knew that I'd made the right choice. It just wasn't the place I want to be in.
Right.
Let me give you something in this book to show you
Okay.
what we've been talking about here. We could get 40 or get 16 airplanes off the ground and in formation in a minute and 45 seconds. When we came in for a landing where you were always short on gas, we could get them on the ground in 45 seconds. Okay, here you go. I was leading this formation right here.
Oh, yeah?
It says here, peel up for landing. That was not peel up for landing. This is a mistake. This was taken off on a mission. We simply, lead plane would go out 1 minute, circle, and come back across the field. And as you came back, all these other planes would tuck inside of you and get in formation. So you had a minute out and 45 seconds coming back. And we always swooped across the field like this as a salute to our ground crews.
Really?
The ground crew was the most important man in the service, in the Air Force.
Why is that?
Because he's the guy that makes that thing fly. He'll stay up all night and work on it. He'll do anything to make it right. And the worst thing could ever happen to a guy would be if he lost his pilot. Even if it wasn't his fault, he'd feel somehow responsible. So this was, but when we came in for landings, we would be strung out all the way out here.